Imagine walking into your own bank, thinking everything is business as usual, until you hear a soft sobbing sound that stops you dead in your tracks. What's happening behind the scenes? And what is the CEO about to uncover in his own company? The truth is far darker than anyone could have guessed. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. John Archer, the CEO of a thriving multinational company, had always prided himself on his ability to stay in control, to ensure everything ran smoothly. But today was different. He had decided to make an unannounced visit to one of the company's smaller, more discreet branches. It was something he did rarely, but he believed in keeping a close eye on the operations, especially when it came to areas he wasn't directly involved in. He didn't expect to walk in on what he was about to see. As he entered the branch's main floor, the hum of busy workers and the constant ringing of phones created a familiar, almost comforting atmosphere. But there was something wrong. Something felt off. The energy was tense. His eyes scanned the room, noticing the hurried whispers and the unusual silence around one particular desk. There, behind the counter, stood a young woman, visibly upset. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to compose herself. Her shoulders trembled, and her hands gripped the desk tightly. John stepped closer, barely making a sound, but then he overheard it. Her supervisor, a man named Thomas, was berating her loudly, his voice cutting through the silence. "How could you make such a mistake?" he snapped, his words echoing in the otherwise quiet space. "Do you have any idea what you've done to this company?" His anger seemed disproportionate, especially considering the setting. This wasn't a private office. It was in front of customers, who now were awkwardly shifting in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the scene. John's stomach tightened. This wasn't just a reprimand. It was cruel and public, designed to humiliate. His instinct told him this was no isolated incident, and the young woman's tear-filled eyes confirmed it. The tension in the room hung thick, and as John made his way to the back office to avoid further disrupting the scene, his mind started racing. What had he just witnessed? This wasn't typical behavior. This wasn't how the company he had built operated. But what really bothered him was the nagging feeling that this might be a symptom of something much larger. He had no evidence, no clear understanding of what was going on. But something was wrong. He could feel it in his gut. As the door to his temporary office clicked shut behind him, John leaned against the desk, deep in thought. This wasn't just about one manager's outburst. There was something else here, a culture of fear, perhaps, or something worse. The unease gnawed at him, and despite all his years of business experience, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something bigger. He had to find out what was going on, what was hidden beneath the surface. For now, he could only wait and watch carefully. But the truth was, John didn't believe in coincidence. He was going to find out, no matter what it took. The unsettling feeling from his earlier visit to the branch continued to linger in John's mind. He couldn't shake the image of the young woman in tears, humiliated by her superior in front of customers. It wasn't just about one incident. Something felt deeply wrong, as if there were a pattern, a culture of fear and control that no one had addressed. John had built this company from the ground up, and he had always believed that integrity was its backbone. But now, as he thought back on that moment, doubts began to creep in. John wasn't one to jump to conclusions without evidence. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that something was off. The staff at the branch had always seemed stressed, and there were whispers of management's overbearing control. But no one had ever spoken out about it. That evening, he sat in his office, his mind racing with questions. Could the issue be more widespread than he thought? Could there be a larger problem at the heart of his company? The next day, he reached out to Sarah, one of the senior executives. She was someone he trusted. She had been with the company for years, seen it grow from a small startup to the powerhouse it was now. If anyone knew what was going on, it would be her. But when John asked her about the branch, her response was hesitant. "John, I've heard things." But she trailed off, her voice tight. "People are afraid to speak up. They're scared of what might happen if they do." John furrowed his brow. "What do you mean? You're telling me no one has reported this before?" Sarah sighed, looking out the window as though searching for the right words. It's not just one bad manager, John. There's a culture of intimidation. Some of the senior staff, they run things with an iron fist. I'm just not sure how deep it goes. Her words weighed heavily on him. John had built a reputation for transparency. But now, the more he heard, the more he realized just how little he truly knew about the inner workings of his own company. Was his vision clouded by the success? He trusted his staff, but trust alone couldn't protect the company from corruption or injustice. Something had to be done. With a growing sense of urgency, John decided to dig deeper. He started by speaking to other employees, some of whom, like Sarah, were hesitant to speak up. He didn't push them too hard, but the more he listened, the clearer the picture became. Several employees spoke of being regularly reprimanded for trivial mistakes, and some mentioned being reprimanded harshly in front of clients. The stories piled up, each one a piece of a puzzle he hadn't known existed. Then, one afternoon, while reviewing some files from the branch, John encountered something that only deepened his suspicions. A critical document, one that could provide him with crucial insight into the situation, was missing. The absence of the file wasn't an accident. He'd seen it just the day before, and now it was gone. He quickly checked with the office staff, but no one had seen it. Whoever had taken it had been careful, methodical. This wasn't some isolated glitch in the system. Someone was actively hiding the truth. John's blood ran cold. He couldn't ignore the mounting evidence any longer. Whoever was behind this, whether it was one person or a group, had the power to manipulate things from within. He had to act, and act fast. But a voice in his head warned him. Challenging the system meant more than just confronting a few rogue employees. It meant going up against the very structure that had helped the company succeed. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the empty file in front of him. The weight of the decision settled heavily on his shoulders. Should he continue to push forward, risking everything he'd built, or should he back off and let it go, hoping the problem would somehow resolve itself? But there was no way he could live with himself if he did nothing. His gut told him there was more at play here, something much darker than a few disgruntled employees. With resolve hardening inside him, John made up his mind. He would not turn away. It was time to uncover the truth. No matter the cost, the investigation would not be easy, and the path ahead would be fraught with obstacles. But he knew that without confronting this head-on, he couldn't move forward. The truth had to come out. John's mind raced as he sat in his office, staring at the scattered documents in front of him. The missing file had been the final push he needed. It was clear now. There was something far more troubling happening within his company. He could no longer ignore the whispers he had heard, the signs that pointed to something much larger than a few isolated incidents of mismanagement. He had to know what was going on, no matter what it cost him. The following days were a blur of quiet investigation. John wasn't sure whom to trust, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. He began by speaking with employees from various departments, adopting a low-profile approach to gather information without raising suspicion. He'd been in the business long enough to know how to spot when someone was holding back. It was subtle, the way they glanced over their shoulders before answering, the nervous shifts in their posture, and the sudden silences. But John's gut told him that these weren't just the usual office politics at play. There was something deeper, more sinister, lurking under the surface. He wasn't alone in his search. Michael, a senior employee who had been with the company for years, reached out to John after catching wind of his investigation. Michael was someone John respected, a solid, dependable worker who had seen the company evolve over time. John trusted him, but he wasn't sure if Michael was ready to speak freely. John, this isn't just a few bad decisions, Michael began in a hushed voice when they met in the break room. It's the whole culture. It's how things are done. The management's been pulling the strings for so long that no one knows who to trust anymore. John leaned in, his curiosity piqued. What do you mean? Can you give me an example? Michael hesitated, his eyes darting around as if he expected someone to overhear them. It's not just about the little things, the bullying, the harsh discipline. It's bigger than that. They've been covering up financial problems, masking losses. If anyone catches wind of it, they make sure it disappears. People are scared. John, scared to speak out. John sat back, digesting the gravity of what Michael had just said. If this was true, the implications were enormous. This wasn't just about an overbearing manager, it was a systemic issue that could shake the very foundations of the company. Determined to get to the bottom of it, John began to dig deeper. He took it slow at first, visiting parts of the office where few executives ventured: storage rooms, back offices, and supply areas. He found his way to places where records were kept under lock and key. Places that weren't meant to be seen by the public eye. John carefully reviewed the materials, hoping to find a lead, something that would reveal the truth. But the deeper he went, the more the walls seemed to close in on him. A few days later, he stumbled upon something critical, a document that could prove the financial mismanagement Michael had spoken of. It was an internal audit report, one that detailed discrepancies in revenue and expenses, possibly linked to money being funneled away into secret accounts. The file had been marked confidential, and it was tucked away in a folder that seemed completely out of place. His heart raced as he skimmed the pages. This could be the breakthrough he needed. However, as he was about to make a copy, something happened that made his blood run cold. The file suddenly disappeared. It wasn't a simple case of misplacement. John retraced his steps, asking around, but no one could explain where it had gone. The information was gone, vanished. He had no choice but to assume that someone, somewhere within the company, was actively covering their tracks. His suspicion had been right. There were powerful forces at work here. Frustration settled in, but John refused to back down. He still had the pieces of the puzzle, he just had to find a way to put them together. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about corporate malfeasance. It was about trust, about people who had turned their backs on the values the company had been built upon. But John wasn't ready to give up. If anything, the missing file only strengthened his resolve. He knew that the deeper he dug, the more dangerous the situation would become. But he had to do it. He had to uncover the truth, even if it meant going up against his own company. Then, just when he thought he had the pieces he needed, another obstacle appeared. One of the employees he had been counting on, someone who had promised to provide him with key information, backed out at the last moment. The pressure from management had finally gotten to them. The threat of losing their job, or worse, had silenced them. It was as if the walls were closing in on him from all sides. John stood in the empty hallway, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his chest. He had the evidence, the witnesses, but the closer he got to the truth, the more resistance he faced. He could feel the power of the system pushing back. The question was, how far would he go to bring the truth to light? Could he risk everything, his career, his relationships, his company, for something that might never be believed? As the days passed, John felt the pressure mounting. But one thing was clear, there was no turning back. Whatever happened next, he had to see this through to the end. The tension in the room was palpable as John entered the conference room. Mark, the branch manager, was seated at the head of the table, exuding confidence that bordered on arrogance. His reputation had been one of competence. But now, as John stepped in, he saw something different in Mark's eyes. It wasn't just ambition anymore, it was a hunger for control. The kind of hunger that could take down anything in its path if left unchecked. John, it's good to see you. I hope you've had a chance to review the latest performance reports. Mark began, his tone smooth but edged with a certain challenge. The casual greeting did nothing to hide the fact that Mark had been expecting this confrontation for a while. John nodded, his eyes scanning the room as he sat down across from Mark. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. This wasn't just a routine meeting. This was the moment that would define whether or not he could still salvage his company. His vision, or if Mark's dark influence had already taken root too deep to remove. I've seen them, John replied, his voice steady. He'd gone over the reports before the meeting. Some of the numbers were troubling. But it was more than that. It was the pattern he had uncovered: manipulation, lies, and mismanagement that ran much deeper than Mark's controlling behavior. Mark's smile didn't reach his eyes as he leaned forward slightly. I trust you understand the pressures we're under to maintain profitability. But I assure you, John, everything here is under control. You've got a good team, and they know their roles. John's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about profitability, it was about something far more dangerous. Mark was using his position to control not only his staff but also the financial aspects of the company. John had found documents that pointed to a series of dubious financial transactions, money being funneled into untraceable accounts, deals being made under the table. He needed to act fast, but he couldn't let Mark see his hand just yet. As the meeting continued, John felt increasingly cornered. Mark's calm exterior was a mask, hiding a ruthless strategist underneath. Mark was playing the long game, trying to assert his dominance and keep John off balance. John knew that Mark was smart, dangerously smart, and John would need to match his opponent move for move. A few minutes into the meeting, as Mark casually rattled off figures and tried to steer the conversation into more trivial matters, John's mind was elsewhere, focusing on the documents he'd uncovered. His thoughts were interrupted when he noticed something, a flicker of hesitation in Mark's otherwise controlled demeanor as he glanced at one of the financial projections. It was subtle, but John caught it. There was something more to the numbers than Mark was letting on. As John carefully steered the conversation back to the financial issues, Mark's calm demeanor began to crack. "I've been reviewing some of the recent transactions," John said, his voice cool, deliberately not giving away the depth of his knowledge. "And I have some questions about the accounts you've been managing." Mark stiffened, his fingers drumming on the table, the only sign of his discomfort. "There's nothing unusual about the accounts, John. You know as well as I do that businesses sometimes have to move funds around for various reasons." John leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not talking about moving funds, Mark. I'm talking about the numbers, the discrepancies, the accounts that don't match up. And I'm talking about the fact that I have documents that prove financial misconduct on your part." Mark's face twisted for a moment, a flicker of panic that John immediately latched onto. But it passed quickly, replaced by a steely glare. "You're barking up the wrong tree here, John. I've been running this branch successfully for years, and I don't need to answer to you for every little decision I make." The tension in the room thickened. John knew he had to be careful. Mark wasn't just a manager, he was a force in the company. A force that had the power to make or break careers. But John wasn't afraid. He had too much on the line, and too much truth to hide. Before John could respond, there was a shift in Mark's demeanor, subtle, yet noticeable. Mark knew the walls were closing in. His eyes flickered to the door. And John knew it wasn't just about this meeting. It was about control. About a future where Mark thought he could manipulate the company's direction, free from accountability. Then, as John was about to lay out the full extent of his findings, Mark spoke again, this time with a chilling calm. "You're making a mistake, John. You think you're going to clean house here? You won't be able to fight this. There's too much at stake. Too many people involved. If you go after me, you'll be exposing more than you ever intended." John felt a chill creep down his spine. This wasn't just a power struggle between two executives anymore. This was about something bigger, something far more dangerous. Mark had aligned himself with forces within the company, forces that would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. John's mind raced. He had no choice now but to push forward. This wasn't just about confronting Mark. This was about protecting everything he had worked for, his company, his employees, and the integrity he had once thought the company stood for. "I'm not backing down," John said firmly, "and you can't intimidate me. Mark, you might have power here, but I have the truth, and that's something you can't control." For a moment, there was silence. Mark's face twisted into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see, John, we'll see." The meeting ended, but John's mind was far from done. He had just entered into a high-stakes battle, and he knew the consequences of failure. But he couldn't walk away now. He had to finish what he'd started. John sat in his office, his fingers nervously tapping the desk as he reviewed the evidence he had gathered. He had spent the last few days meticulously compiling documents, meeting with employees, and piecing together a plan that might finally expose Mark's manipulation in the dark underbelly of the company. It wasn't just about Mark anymore, it was about the future of the business, the values it had once stood for, and the people who had suffered in silence. John had always prided himself on being methodical and strategic. Now, with the truth slowly coming into view, he knew he had to move carefully. He couldn't just rush in. guns blazing. Mark had too much power, too many allies in high places, and John needed to find a way to strike without tipping his hand too early. His thoughts were interrupted when Sarah, the senior employee who had become his ally, walked into the room. John had been grateful for her support. She had once been hesitant, unsure whether John's pursuit of the truth was worth the risk. But after seeing the mounting evidence, Sarah had come to believe that John's fight wasn't just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced by fear. She was now fully on board. "We're getting closer," Sarah said, her voice low, as she sat across from him. "I've talked to a few more people, ones who were too scared to speak up before. They're willing to help, John. They know what's going on. They just need some assurance." John nodded, but the weight of the task ahead still pressed on him. He was beginning to gather a small network of people who had witnessed Mark's abuse of power. But he knew it wouldn't be enough. Mark had too many ways to cover his tracks. Too many people in his corner willing to do whatever it took to protect him. They needed hard evidence, something irrefutable. "I've been looking into some of the places where Mark might be hiding documents. There's a meeting later today, and I've arranged to be there. I think this could be our chance to find something that ties everything together," John said, his voice full of determination. Sarah leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "I trust you, but be careful. Mark's not an idiot. If he even suspects what we're doing, he'll crush us before we even have a chance to act." John looked at her, his expression serious. "I'm prepared for that. I can't turn back now. Not with everything on the line." Later that day, John found himself walking through a dimly lit hallway, hidden away in a section of the building that few executives knew about. He had gained access to this part of the office through a well-placed favor, and it led to a small, secret meeting room where Mark often held discussions that were off the books. It was here that John hoped to uncover the kind of evidence that would change everything. Inside, the room smelled of old wood and papers. A single desk sat in the middle of the room, and on it, several files and binders were neatly stacked. John's heart raced as he opened the first binder, flipping through the pages until he found what he was looking for: transaction records, lists of accounts, names that didn't appear on any official documents. It was all starting to make sense. Mark had been using this hidden office to funnel money, to cover up his tracks. The evidence was right in front of him. But just as John was about to take a photo of the records, he heard a noise at the door. His heart stopped. Someone was coming. He quickly shoved the binder back into place and crouched behind a stack of boxes. Holding his breath, the footsteps grew louder, and then the door creaked open. John's pulse raced as he peered through the crack in the door. It was Michael, one of the few people who had been willing to help him. Michael had agreed to meet him here, to share the information he had gathered. But as John watched, Michael froze. "What are you doing here?" Mark's voice echoed through the room. John felt the blood drain from his face. Michael had been caught. There was no turning back now. The meeting ended quickly after that. John heard Mark's voice rise in anger, followed by the sound of Michael's desperate protests. The tension in the air was thick, and John knew what had happened before Michael even said it. When John met Michael in the hallway later, Michael's face was pale, and his eyes were filled with fear. "I'm sorry, John. I can't do this anymore. They've threatened me. They said they'll destroy me if I continue to help you." John's stomach churned. This wasn't just about the company anymore, it was personal. Mark wasn't just protecting his interests, he was actively silencing those who had the courage to stand up. "Michael, don't do this. You can't just back out now. We have the truth, we're so close. You know what he's done," John pleaded, but Michael was shaking his head. "I can't, John. They've made it clear. My job, my family. I can't lose everything." As Michael turned and walked away, John felt a pang of helplessness. This was the price of exposing the truth. People who were too scared to take the final step. People who didn't have the strength to see it through. He was losing allies, and with each loss, the burden grew heavier. But John couldn't give up. He had to continue, even if it meant going it alone. The system was broken, and he couldn't let it continue. He had the evidence now. He had to make his move. As he left the office, the weight of the situation pressed on him. His fight had only just begun, and he was running out of time. But there was one thing he knew for sure: he wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. John couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. He had spent days, weeks, carefully plotting his next steps, gathering evidence, and gaining allies. But with Mark's power growing every day, John knew he had to act now, or risk losing everything. The battle was no longer just about exposing Mark's corruption, it was about survival. If John didn't fight back, he would lose his company, and the values it was built on, forever. Sarah, ever the loyal ally, had become more than just a confidant at this point. She had become a crucial piece in his plan. She had access to internal information that John couldn't reach on his own. And over the last few days, she had gathered enough evidence to finally corner Mark. The thought of this victory, though, brought little comfort. John knew he would be stepping into a storm that would test his strength and his will to see it through. "I've gathered the last of the documents," Sarah said one evening as she walked into John's office, a folder heavy with incriminating material in her hands. She placed it on the desk between them, her face tense, but determined. "It's all here, John. We've got enough to hit him where it hurts. But we have to be careful. If we do this, there's no turning back." John looked at the folder, then at Sarah, his thoughts racing. This was it, the moment he had been working toward. But he wasn't naive. He knew the risks involved. "I've thought it through," he said, running his hand through his hair. "We'll take the information public. We can't wait for the internal system to fix itself. Mark is too powerful. If we don't act now, he'll bury everything." Sarah nodded but didn't seem fully at ease. "I agree, but once it's out there, Mark will come after us. We'll be exposed. There's no way to know how far he'll go to protect his empire." John met her gaze, his jaw clenched. "I've made peace with that. I can't sit back and watch him destroy everything we've built." The next day, John called a high-level meeting with his most trusted team members, including Sarah. The decision was made: public exposure. They would release some of the evidence to the press, targeting the financial misdeeds that Mark had tried so hard to hide. The press would be their megaphone, their weapon. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only way to force Mark into a corner. John knew the media would turn the spotlight on them immediately, but he had confidence in the evidence. They had spent hours cross-referencing everything, leaving no room for Mark to deny the truth. John's heart raced as he prepared the statement. This was their moment to shine, to bring down the man who had wreaked havoc on their company from the inside out. The moment came when Sarah handed him the final draft of the press release. "This is it," she said, her voice heavy with anticipation. "Once you send this out, there's no turning back." John stared at the words on the screen. His finger hovered over the send button. But before he could click, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number. As he opened the text, his heart sank. It was a message from Sarah. "I'm sorry, John. I have no choice. Mark made me do this. I've sent everything to him. They know everything. We're finished." John's blood ran cold. He stared at the message, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Sarah, the one person he trusted more than anyone, had betrayed him. She had sent the very information that could have ended Mark's reign straight into his hands. His pulse quickened, and his thoughts spiraled. How could she do this? What was left for him to fight for now? The phone slipped from his hands, landing softly on the desk. He stood up, his hands shaking. This wasn't just a professional betrayal, it was personal. Sarah had been his closest ally, someone he thought shared his vision, his passion for justice, and now she had thrown him to the wolves. He quickly gathered himself, determined not to let this defeat him. There had to be a way out of this, a way to salvage what was left. But as he walked down the hall to confront Sarah, his mind raced with the implications. If Mark had the evidence now, John was no longer the one in control of the situation. The very foundation of his plan had just crumbled beneath him. When John reached Sarah's office, she wasn't there. He stood for a moment, looking at the empty space that had once been a place of collaboration and trust. It felt wrong, like everything had suddenly shifted. The door to her office was slightly ajar, and John pushed it open, hoping for an explanation, some sort of justification for what she had done. But Sarah was gone. Her desk was bare, her things packed up and removed, It was as if she had disappeared into thin air, leaving behind only the echoes of her betrayal. John's mind went into overdrive. This was more than just a personal betrayal, it was part of Mark's plan. Mark had known all along what John was up to, and he had played his cards perfectly. With Sarah now out of the picture and the press release turned against him, John realized he had no choice but to prepare for the worst. It wasn't just about exposing Mark anymore. It was about surviving this battle. He was no longer fighting just for the truth, now. It was a fight for his own survival. If he didn't act fast, Mark would win, not only the company but everything John had worked for. John sat alone in his office, the weight of betrayal still fresh on his mind. The trust he had placed in Sarah had been shattered in an instant. And with her departure, his remaining allies seemed fewer by the day. But even in the face of adversity, he was far from defeated. If anything, Sarah's betrayal had fueled him further. It was clear now, Mark was playing for keeps. And if John was going to survive this, he had to act fast. The company he had spent years building was crumbling, and he couldn't stand by and watch it fall. He wasn't just fighting for the company anymore, he was fighting for his own sense of integrity. He knew he couldn't win this war alone, so he began to gather what remained of his team. It wasn't much, just a handful of loyal employees who still believed in what the company stood for. They were wary, cautious, but they trusted him. That trust was his last lifeline. "We need to strike while we still have the momentum," John said, his voice steady as he addressed the small group in front of him. "Mark is more dangerous now than ever. We have to expose him. But we need to do it strategically. The world is watching." As John began to lay out his plan, he realized that he wasn't just up against Mark. He was up against a system, a well-oiled machine built over years of manipulation and secrecy. Mark had surrounded himself with loyalists who would do anything to protect his empire. But John wasn't backing down. He couldn't afford to. A few days later, John attended a high-profile company event. Mark had decided to host a public conference, showcasing a new project he was launching. The event was carefully designed to reframe his image and solidify his position at the top. He needed the public's trust, and John knew this was his opportunity. This wasn't just about exposing Mark's corruption, it was about taking back the narrative. Putting Mark on the defensive. The event took place in a grand conference hall, filled with company leaders, journalists, and industry experts. Mark stood at the front, delivering his speech with the kind of charisma that made him a formidable force in the business world. He spoke of innovation, future growth, and the company's dedication to its employees. His words were carefully chosen, and he smiled as he addressed the crowd, projecting an image of confidence and success. John, seated in the back of the room, watched with a growing sense of unease. This was Mark at his best, calm, controlled, and completely in his element. But John wasn't fooled. He knew that behind the polished exterior lay a man willing to do anything to maintain his grip on power. The event was a show, a distraction from the deeper issues that plagued the company. As the conference progressed, John's mind raced. He needed to act quickly. The opportunity to expose Mark was slipping through his fingers. But just as he was about to make his move, something unexpected happened. A loud buzz filled the room as an urgent news update flashed on the screens behind Mark. Breaking news. A financial investigation has been launched into several large transactions involving the company. Allegations of embezzlement and money laundering have surfaced, prompting an immediate inquiry by federal authorities. The crowd fell silent as the news sank in. Mark's confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. John could see the panic rising in Mark's face, and for the briefest moment, he felt a rush of victory. Mark was on the ropes. The scandal had broken in the most public way possible, and now John had the upper hand. He could already hear the whispers among the crowd, the skepticism, the doubt that would surely follow Mark's every move. But just as quickly as it had begun, the moment was turned against John, one of his trusted allies. An employee who had been working with him behind the scenes suddenly stood up and began speaking to the media. The words were sharp, carefully crafted to shift the narrative. The employee, Michael, who John had thought was still in his corner, betrayed him in front of the entire room. "This is a misunderstanding," Michael said, his voice calm, yet firm. There are no grounds for these allegations. The company has always acted in good faith. And these claims are false. It is clear that certain individuals are trying to destabilize the company for personal gain. John's heart sank as he watched Michael's words spread through the room like wildfire. The audience seemed to buy it. Mark's camp had managed to regain control of the situation with one well-timed defense. The room, once filled with tension and suspicion, now buzzed with approval for Mark's stance. John realized, too late, that he had underestimated the depth of Mark's influence. The situation had taken a sharp turn. Not only had Mark avoided immediate repercussions, but now John's credibility was in question. His plan had backfired. The betrayal by Michael had stripped him of one of his few remaining allies. And it seemed as though Mark was once again firmly in control. As the event concluded, John walked out of the hall, his mind spinning. He had failed, at least for now. The fight wasn't over, but it had become a battle on a much larger scale. With Michael's betrayal, the public perception had shifted. The pressure was now on John to regroup and salvage what he could. He realized that the war wasn't just about the truth anymore. It was about winning back the hearts and minds of the people who had once stood with him. Mark had used his power and influence to manipulate the narrative, and now John had to figure out how to fight back. The stakes had never been higher, and the cost of failure had never felt more real. The weight of the past few days hung heavy on John's shoulders. His initial victory, exposing the financial discrepancies and pushing Mark into the public eye, had seemed like a turning point. But the betrayal by Sarah, his trusted ally, had sent everything spiraling. The media had eaten up Mark's carefully crafted narrative, and John found himself back at square one. His plan had backfired, and the momentum he had hoped to gain had slipped away. But John wasn't one to give up easily. He knew the battle wasn't over. In fact, it was only getting started. He spent sleepless nights poring over the evidence, refusing to let the shadows of failure cloud his judgment. Somewhere, hidden in the depths of the company, was the truth. He could feel it. The truth that could bring Mark down, expose the full extent of his machinations, and put an end to this chaos once and for all. But finding it was like searching for a needle in a haystack. It was then that Sarah reached out to him, her voice hesitant but urgent over the phone. "John, we need to talk. I made a mistake," she said, her words tinged with regret. John had heard the whispers of her defection, the stories of her siding with Mark, but the desperation in her voice now made him pause. After a long, tense conversation, Sarah revealed that she had seen the true extent of Mark's plan. She had been too scared, too caught up in the pressure. But now she realized what was at stake. Mark was not just a power-hungry manager, he was building alliances, both inside and outside the company, to consolidate his control. And Sarah had learned of a hidden cache of documents, files that could expose Mark's deepest secrets. It was a risk, but she was willing to help John. "I'll lead you to it," Sarah said. "There's a vault under the old office building. It's where Mark keeps everything, his real dealings, the things he wants no one to find. If you can get in there, you'll have everything you need to take him down." Despite the mistrust between them, John knew this was his chance. He didn't hesitate. He quickly gathered his remaining loyal allies, those few employees who still believed in him and the cause. Together, they planned their infiltration into the company's restricted areas. As they made their way through the dimly lit corridors of the old office building, John's heart raced. The sound of their footsteps echoed against the cold walls. But there was no turning back now. With Sarah guiding him, they reached the vault, a thick steel door hidden away in a corner of the building that few knew about. It was here that Mark kept his most sensitive documents, those that could ruin him if the truth came out. John was ready to uncover everything. The room was cold and sterile, filled with boxes, files, and binders stacked high on shelves. John began to sift through the piles of documents, his fingers trembling with anticipation. Hours passed as they scoured the vault, looking for something, anything, that could bring Mark's empire crashing down. Then, amidst a pile of forgotten financial reports, John found something, a folder labeled Confidential, Project X. His pulse quickened. He opened it, scanning the pages rapidly. The information was shocking. Mark's dealings weren't just with shady investors or crooked business partners. He was entangled with powerful political figures, manipulating deals that affected entire industries. The implications were staggering. Mark wasn't just after the company, he was building an entire network of influence that reached far beyond the corporate world. As John sat back, absorbing the weight of what he had just uncovered, the door creaked open behind him. He turned sharply, his heart in his throat. A figure stepped into the dim light of the vault, a man who had been working in the shadows. Someone John had never expected to see. "I thought you'd never find it," the man said quietly, his voice low but steady. "Mark's been planning this for years. The company was always just the beginning." John froze. It was Michael, one of his former allies. The very person he had trusted to help him in this fight. The man who had disappeared without a trace after the betrayal. And now, here he was, standing in front of John, revealing the final piece of the puzzle. "Mark's been using the company as a front," Michael continued, his eyes dark with the weight of his own secrets. "He's been working with political figures, with financial groups. He's been playing both sides. The company, the deals, they're all a means to an end. It's about control. It's about power." John's mind spun. Everything was connected. The shady financial dealings, the hidden alliances, the power plays, all of it was part of Mark's grand plan. But why had Michael come back now? What was his game? "I couldn't stand by and watch him destroy everything," Michael admitted, his voice laced with regret. "But I've learned too much. I'm not going to let him win." "John, you're right. It's time the truth came out. But we need to move fast." As they talked, the weight of the decision pressed on John's chest. He had what he needed, proof of Mark's manipulation, the connections, the dirty dealings. But now, John faced a moral dilemma. If he went public with this information, it would bring down Mark and his empire. But it would also destroy the lives of many innocent employees. People who had no part in Mark's scheme would lose their jobs, their livelihoods, and their reputations. Could he expose Mark without collateral damage? Could he live with the consequences of his actions? John stared at the evidence in his hands, knowing that the moment of truth had arrived. He could no longer stay in the shadows. The time for silence was over. But as the weight of his decision settled in, he couldn't shake the nagging thought that once the truth was out, nothing would ever be the same again, not just for Mark, but for everyone involved. John leaned back in his chair, staring at the papers in front of him. The documents, the evidence, all the information he had painstakingly collected over the past few months, it was all leading to this moment. This was it, the final confrontation with Mark. The time had come for the truth to be exposed, for the corrupt empire that Mark had built to finally come crashing down. John had never been more determined, but he knew the stakes. If he failed, everything he had fought for would be lost, and Mark would continue to reign over the company with impunity. His team was small now, a few loyal employees who had stuck by him through thick and thin. They were nervous but resolute. John could see the doubt in their eyes, the fear of what might happen if they lost. But they had no choice. They had to follow through. "I'm not backing down," John said, his voice steady. "We've come this far, and I won't let Mark destroy everything we've built." Sarah, who had returned after her betrayal, stood beside him. She had been instrumental in gathering the final pieces of evidence that would expose Mark's crimes. She had come back, determined to make things right, and John couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude, even though the sting of her earlier betrayal still lingered. "We have the evidence, John," Sarah said, her voice firm. "This is our chance, but we need to be careful. Mark won't go down without a fight." John nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Mark had already proven that he would stop at nothing to maintain his control. But John had one advantage: the truth. The public would finally know what kind of man Mark really was. And that was something Mark couldn't hide for much longer. The courtroom was set. The tension in the air was thick as John and his team walked into the courthouse, each step echoing in the cold, sterile halls. The media was already gathered outside, waiting for the hearing to begin. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, filled with lawyers, executives, and reporters, all waiting for the truth to come out. Mark was there, of course, seated at the front with his legal team, exuding the same confidence he always had. But there was something different in his eyes now, a flicker of uncertainty. John could see it, and it gave him a small measure of hope. Mark knew what was coming. He knew John had the upper hand, and he was desperate to keep it from slipping away. The judge called the court to order, and the proceedings began. John's lawyer stood up to present the case, and the room fell silent. The time had come to reveal everything. John's heart raced as he watched the screen flash with evidence, financial records, emails, and documents that tied Mark to illegal activities. This was the moment of truth. Your Honor, John's lawyer began, we present to the court the following evidence that proves Mr. Mark Johnson's involvement in a series of financial crimes, including embezzlement, money laundering, and the manipulation of company funds for personal gain. The room was electric with murmurs. Mark's face grew pale as the evidence was laid out before him. He had been cornered. It was clear that the truth was finally getting out. But just as John felt the first surge of victory, a sudden disruption threw everything into chaos. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and a commotion broke out in the back. Security rushed in, and the judge banged his gavel, trying to restore order. John's heart stopped as he saw what was happening. One of the key pieces of evidence, the document that connected Mark to the political figures and the financial partners, was being stolen. It was right there on the table, but someone had snatched it away, and before anyone could react, it was gone. The room erupted into chaos. The media scrambled for a story, and Mark's lawyer was quick to seize the opportunity, declaring that the evidence had been tampered with. Mark stood, his face a picture of feigned shock, as he pointed at John. This is a setup, he shouted, his voice rising in the courtroom. The evidence has been manipulated. This is nothing but a smear campaign against me. John's stomach sank as he watched the situation spiral out of control. His victory had been ripped away in an instant. The key piece of evidence was gone, and with it, the strongest part of his case. Mark had managed to turn the tide in his favor once again, using the stolen document to accuse John of orchestrating a false case against him. The media ate it up, and for a moment, it seemed like Mark had regained the upper hand. John stood motionless, his mind racing. Everything he had worked for, all the sacrifices, the hours of investigation, the allies he had lost, it was all slipping through his fingers. The weight of the situation threatened to crush him. But even as despair began to set in, something inside him snapped. He couldn't afford to give up. Not now, not when he was so close. He looked at his remaining allies, the loyal few who still believed in the fight for justice. They were watching him, waiting for him to make a move. And that's when it hit him. He didn't need to rely solely on the stolen evidence. He had something far more powerful, the truth. The whole truth. With newfound resolve, John stood up. Your Honor, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. I may have lost a piece of evidence today, but I have something more important, the truth. And I'm not going to let Mark use his influence to bury it. John turned to the press, his voice steady. Mark's empire is built on lies, manipulation, and deceit. It's time for the world to know who he truly is. The truth will come out, and no matter how hard Mark tries to hide it, he won't be able to run from what he's done. The room fell silent as John's words echoed in the air. It wasn't over yet, but he had just taken back control. He would find a way to expose Mark, even if it meant taking a risk. He wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The moment of truth had arrived. John sat at his desk, the weight of the past few months pressing heavily on his shoulders. The battle had been long and exhausting, but finally, there was a flicker of hope. The evidence he had fought so hard to collect, the countless hours of investigation, the sacrifices, everything was about to come to a head. But as the tension in the air grew thicker, he realized that the final confrontation would not be easy. Not by any means. John had reached out to his last few allies, those who still believed in what he was fighting for. They had worked tirelessly behind the scenes to uncover Mark's corruption, to expose the financial and political dealings that had been hidden for so long. But there was still one missing piece, the evidence that had been stolen. The key that could unlock the entire web of deceit. It was then that John received a message, a call that would change everything. The voice on the other end of the line was unexpected, a voice from the shadows of the company. It was from Michael, the insider who had once betrayed him. But now, Michael was offering something John desperately needed: the missing evidence. "I've had enough," Michael said, his voice a mix of regret and resolve. "I've seen the destruction Mark has caused, and I can't sit by any longer. I know where the evidence is hidden. I'll get it to you." John's heart raced. This was the break he had been waiting for. With Michael's help, they could finally expose Mark's plans for good. But John also knew that this wouldn't be easy. Mark would stop at nothing to protect his empire, and John would have to be prepared for the fight of his life. A few hours later, they met in secret, in a quiet corner of the city. Michael handed over the documents, and John could feel the weight of them in his hands. This was it, the moment he had been working toward for so long. The documents contained everything: Mark's ties to outside political and financial entities, the illegal transactions, the manipulation of the company's funds. Everything was here, in his hands. He could almost taste victory. With the final pieces of the puzzle in place, John made his move. He organized a high-stakes meeting, one that would finally put an end to Mark's reign. The setting was a large, high-security conference room at the company's headquarters. It was here that the final confrontation would take place. Mark, knowing that his empire was on the verge of collapse, had already assembled his legal team and a group of loyalists. John arrived early, his nerves steady, his mind clear. He knew the risks, but this was his only chance to end this once and for all. His lawyer stood by him, ready to present the evidence that would bring Mark to justice. But John's thoughts weren't just focused on the legal battle ahead. He had to think bigger. This wasn't just about Mark, it was about the future of the company. The future of everyone who had been affected by Mark's greed and manipulation. As the meeting began, John took a deep breath and stood in front of the room, facing Mark and his allies. He could see the tension in the air, the palpable fear that now radiated from Mark. This was the moment Mark had been dreading. John's hand shook slightly as he placed the documents on the table in front of him. "Ladies and gentlemen," John began, his voice calm but powerful, "I stand before you today not just to fight for my company, but to fight for the truth. These documents, which I'm about to present, will expose everything: Mark's corruption, the deals he's made with outside forces, the lies he's been feeding us all." The room fell silent as the documents were spread out before everyone. John could feel Mark's eyes on him, his gaze cold and calculating. But Mark's composure was starting to crack. The truth was coming, and there was no escaping it. John's lawyer took over, presenting the evidence piece by piece, each document revealing more about Mark's manipulation and control. The tension in the room mounted as Mark's defenses crumbled. But just as John thought victory was within reach, a sudden twist turned the tide. One of Mark's loyalists, a key player in the room, stepped forward and spoke up. It was Michael, the same person who had handed over the documents just hours before. John's heart sank as Michael turned on him, revealing that Mark had been working with powerful political and financial allies outside the company. Michael had been a part of that network all along. "This isn't what it seems," Michael said, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "Mark's influence goes far beyond this company. You don't understand the full scope of what's happening here. He's not just playing a game for power. This is much bigger than that." The revelation hit John like a ton of bricks. He had thought he had everything under control, but now it seemed that Mark had connections and resources that went far beyond his initial understanding. The fight had just gotten even more complicated. But John wasn't ready to give up. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. He could feel the weight of the decision he had to make. The truth was out. But what did it mean for the company? For the people who had trusted him? John turned to the room, his voice unwavering. "Mark may have allies, but he doesn't have the truth. And as long as I'm standing, I'll make sure that truth is heard." The final moments of the meeting were a blur. The room erupted into chaos as both sides scrambled to gain control of the situation. But it was clear to John now, the battle wasn't just about bringing Mark down. It was about making sure the company could survive, rebuilding it from the ground up. Mark may have had the upper hand for now, but John had the one thing Mark could never take: the resolve to keep fighting for what was right. John sat at his desk, staring out of the window, watching the city below. The weight of the past few weeks pressed heavily on his chest. He had won. There was no denying that. Mark had been exposed. The truth about his financial schemes and manipulations brought into the light for everyone to see. The company had taken swift action. And Mark was gone, dismissed from his position and facing legal investigations that could end his career for good. For a moment, it felt like justice had been served. But the victory didn't feel as sweet as he thought it would. John's hands were still shaking, his mind replaying the events of the past few days. He had achieved what he set out to do. But at what cost? The company had been shaken to its core. The trust, the morale, it had all been shattered. The team he had once worked alongside now felt like strangers. And he himself was no longer the same person. The man who had walked into this battle was gone, replaced by someone else, someone who had seen too much, lost too much, and sacrificed too much to ever return to the person he once was. As he turned back to the papers on his desk, he knew the real work was just beginning. Mark's removal was only the first step. The company, while free of its corrupt leader, was far from being healed. The wounds ran deep, and the culture that had allowed Mark to thrive in the first place needed to be addressed. But would anyone be willing to face those deeper issues? Would they be willing to change? Later that day, a public meeting was called. John had decided it was time for the board of directors to address the company, to make the hard decisions about the future. The room was packed with employees, reporters, and investors, all eager to hear what would come next. John stood at the podium, facing a sea of expectant faces. His heart was heavy, but his resolve was stronger than ever. "We've made significant progress," he began, his voice steady. "Mark has been removed from his position, and he will face the consequences of his actions. But this is just the beginning. The work we must do now is to rebuild, not just the company, but the trust we've lost." As he spoke, John could feel the eyes of the room on him, some filled with hope, others with skepticism. He knew that many still weren't convinced that the company could change. The systems in place had been built over years, decades even, and it wasn't something that could be undone overnight. But before John could continue, there was an interruption. The door to the meeting room opened, and a familiar face walked in. It was Henry, a longtime ally of John's and a key player on the board. He was the one person John had relied on the most, the one person he thought was always on his side. But as Henry stood in front of the room, something in his demeanor had shifted. His face was tense, his eyes cold. John felt a chill run down his spine. Something wasn't right. Henry cleared his throat. "While I agree that Mark's actions were unforgivable, I think we need to be cautious. John's approach, while admirable, might be too drastic. We must think about the future of the company. How can we move forward without disrupting everything? We cannot afford to tear down everything that has made us successful." John felt his pulse quicken. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Henry had always been the one to support him, to back his decisions. But now, it seemed like he was questioning everything. Was he just speaking out of concern for the company's future? Or was there something more to it? "Henry," John said, trying to keep his voice calm, "we can't keep ignoring the issues that have plagued this company for years. Mark didn't just make mistakes. He exploited the system, and that system is still here. We can't just brush it under the rug." Henry met John's gaze, his expression hardening. "I'm not saying we ignore it, but we must be careful about how we proceed. The changes you're suggesting." Before he could finish, there was a commotion at the back of the room. A new voice cut through the tension. It was Sarah, the employee who had once been John's ally and had then betrayed him before coming back. She stepped forward, interrupting the conversation. "I've been listening to both of you," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "And I think it's time we all face the truth. This company isn't just about Mark. It's about all of us. The way we've operated, the way we've allowed things to get so out of control, it's not just a leadership problem. It's a cultural problem." Her words rang in the room, and John felt a wave of relief wash over him. Sarah was right. This wasn't just about Mark. It was about changing the system that allowed people like him to rise to power. But as he looked at Henry, he could see the storm brewing. Henry's eyes flicked toward Sarah, his expression darkening. There was more to this than just concern for the company's future. John realized, with a sinking feeling in his stomach, that Henry wasn't just trying to protect the company. He was trying to protect himself. The pieces started to fall into place. Henry had always been part of the system that allowed Mark to thrive. And now that the truth was coming out, he was willing to fight to keep his position. "We need a new direction," Sarah said, breaking John's thoughts. "A direction that doesn't just protect the status quo but makes this company accountable, transparent, and honest. We need real change, not just a change in leadership." John nodded slowly. He had always known this moment would come. The battle wasn't just against Mark, it was against everything that had allowed people like him to succeed. As the meeting continued, John could feel the tension in the room building. He knew what was at stake: the future of the company, his future, and the future of everyone who had been impacted by Mark's corruption. It all hinged on the choices they made now. And as the meeting came to a close, John realized the road ahead would be far more difficult than he ever imagined. Mark might be gone, but a new battle had just begun. One that would require more than just legal victories or public support. It would require a complete overhaul, a new way of thinking, a new way of doing business. It would be painful, and it would take time. But John was ready. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to stop now. John sat in the quiet of his office, staring at the papers scattered in front of him. The weight of his decisions pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had fought a long and brutal battle to expose Mark, and now, finally, he was in a position to make lasting changes. But even as victory loomed before him, he knew that this was only the beginning. The company, as well as himself, had undergone a transformation. But the battle for true justice, justice not just for himself, but for everyone, was far from over. After everything Mark had done, the company was left in ruins. It wasn't just about removing a corrupt leader anymore, it was about rebuilding the entire structure. The very culture that had allowed someone like Mark to thrive in the first place. John had seen the dark side of power, the manipulation, the lies, and he couldn't turn back. The company had to change, and he was the one to lead that change. John had spent weeks meeting with the remaining members of his leadership team. Together, they outlined a path forward, starting with the management structure. He began by appointing new leaders, people who understood the importance of transparency, fairness, and accountability. The old ways, the underhanded tactics that had allowed power to be wielded in secret, were no longer welcome. John knew the road ahead would be difficult. Many would resist the changes, cling to the old ways out of fear, or perhaps out of loyalty to the people who had been removed. But this wasn't just a matter of leadership, it was a matter of ethics, of right and wrong. Sarah had been by his side throughout this entire ordeal, and now more than ever, she was his most trusted ally. Together, they worked tirelessly to draft new policies, ensuring that the employees would have a voice, that their rights would be protected, and that the corporate culture would no longer allow for the abuse of power. Sarah was instrumental in these reforms, not only because of her knowledge of the company's inner workings, but also because of her unwavering commitment to justice. It was no longer just about saving the company, it was about creating something better. Something sustainable, something that would outlive their personal struggles. John knew that the hard work was just beginning. He addressed the company in a series of open meetings, standing before the employees and stakeholders, promising a new era. He spoke with authority but also with humility. "We've been through a lot," he began in one of these meetings. "And now, it's time to rebuild. This company has been wounded. But with each of you, we will heal. We are committed to building an environment that is transparent, fair, and where everyone has a chance to succeed." But even as John spoke these words, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was still amiss. There was a sense of foreboding in the air, a feeling that despite all the steps they had taken to expose the truth, the real battle was still to come. It was as if the shadows were still hiding something that had yet to surface. Just as John was about to conclude his speech, a figure from the back of the room caught his attention. It was an unfamiliar face, someone he hadn't seen in the company before. The man was dressed in a dark suit, his posture rigid, and his eyes intense. He moved through the crowd with purpose, making his way toward John. Before anyone could react, the man handed John an envelope, his face unreadable. "You don't know me," the man said quietly, "but I know what's going on here. The fight isn't over." John's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the tension rising in the room. The envelope contained a single document, a report, meticulously detailed, and outlining a series of transactions that seemed eerily familiar. It was a blueprint, a detailed plan of what appeared to be a new scheme to take control of the company. One that Mark had likely been involved in before his fall. But now, someone else was trying to finish what Mark had started. As John stared at the paper, his mind raced. The report detailed secret meetings, financial backdoor deals, and connections to a number of external entities, organizations and individuals who had never before been linked to the company. The name on the paper was one John recognized but hadn't thought about in months. It was someone close to the company, someone who had been working behind the scenes during the entire ordeal. "Who is this?" John asked, his voice steady but filled with a growing sense of urgency. The man looked around cautiously before answering. "I can't say much right now. But I believe you're not the only one who's been manipulated. The truth runs deeper than you know." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. John's heart sank as the realization set in. This battle was not over. It would never truly be over as long as there were those who were willing to fight for power at any cost. The shadows, the manipulations, everything had only just begun to unfold. He turned to Sarah, who was standing nearby, her face pale as she read the document. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John looked at her, his expression grim but resolute. "We keep fighting. We can't let this happen again. This company belongs to the people who work here, not the ones who want to control it for their own gain." John realized then that true justice wasn't a destination. It wasn't something that could be won in a single battle or by one person alone. Justice was a journey, a constant pursuit that required vigilance, courage, and the willingness to sacrifice. It would never be easy. It would always demand more than anyone could give. But John had learned a valuable lesson over the past year. Justice was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. As the meeting ended and people began to file out of the room, John stood still, the weight of the decision before him settling heavily on his chest. He had won the fight against Mark, but he knew that the war was far from over. There would always be those who would rise up to challenge what was right, who would seek to manipulate, control, and destroy. And yet, as John walked out of the conference room, he knew that this time, he would be ready. This time, he wouldn't let the darkness consume him. The fight for justice, for fairness, was ongoing. It was a fight that would define not just the company's future, but his own. As we reach the end of this incredible journey, it's clear that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. John's story shows us that sometimes, the fight for justice isn't just about exposing the wrongdoers, it's about transforming the very system that allowed such things to happen. It's about making difficult choices, standing firm even when faced with betrayal, and ultimately doing what's right, no matter the personal cost. What do you think? Is it enough to change the system from within? Or does it require a complete overhaul? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths. We've got many more hidden stories to share with you. Thank you for watching.